We more than most, we understand and appreciate how busy members of Congress are. So we're expecting Senator Ernst to hopefully join us in a few minutes. And before then, I guess, Jonathan, we can sort of get started and have a quick chat about today's webinar and sort of about where we've been here, because we don't, always. This is the 7th episode. Oh, hello, Senator. How are you?
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, yes, I apologize. We were voting on the floor.
No worries, no worries. Thank you for making it, and we'll get started here. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this 7th episode of our Pentagon Purse Strings series. I'm Andrew Lautz, Director of Federal Policy at National Taxpayers Union. With me is my co-host, Jonathan Bidlack. He's the Director of the Governance Program at the R Street Institute. And we're both very excited for our main topic and our special guests today. Our first guest, Senator Joni Ernst, is a native of Red Oak, Iowa, and she has served as U.S. Senator for Iowa since January 2015. Before that, she served in the military for over 23 years and became the first female combat veteran elected to serve in the U.S. Senate. Currently in her 2nd term, Senator Ernst serves on the committees on Armed Services, Agriculture, Environment and Public Works, and Small Business. Senator Ernst has also been a leader in fighting government waste of taxpayer dollars. She also has not been afraid to call out when the Department of Defense is falling short of its responsibility to taxpayers, and the senator co-led a letter to Secretary of Defense Austin earlier this year urging the Pentagon to complete its audit process in a timely and efficient manner. We're excited to talk to Senator Ernst about DoD's audits and her efforts to cut wasteful spending across government. But first, Senator, I think you have some remarks for us. So thanks so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew, for the kind introduction and, of course, for inviting me to engage in today's discussion. And thanks to the National Taxpayers Union and the R Street Institute for hosting this webinar and for all of the hard work that's gone into advocating for free markets and limited but effective government. And folks, we've already seen what happens when there's a one-party rule in Washington, a radical expansion of the federal government and out-of-control spending. And Iowans sent me to the Senate to hold Washington bureaucrats accountable and to take on waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. And though it's not a great way to make friends, I have been committed to that mission since day one. And some of you might know that I had a 23-year military career. I did retire as a lieutenant colonel in the Iowa Army National Guard after I was elected to the United States Senate. And I love our military, and I'm certainly grateful for my time in uniform. But my pride for our armed forces doesn't mean that I let the wasteful spending habits of the Pentagon go unchecked. It is time for financial accountability in the DoD. And I am disappointed that year after year, the department fails to pass a timely audit and complete a clean scrub of its books. I do think that that is very important. When it comes to our military, it's critical we make sure every single dollar spent goes towards supporting the men and women who actually defend our nation, and not get lost in all of these worn out legacy systems, the antiquated supply chains, and deteriorating programs of record. So how do we get there? I think the first step is encouraging bottom-up innovation. Before 2018, the Air Force was spending $10,000 to replace toilet seat covers on the C-5 Galaxy aircraft, which is inexcusable. So innovative airmen at the 60th Maintenance Squadron at Travis Air Force Base took action and are now producing the part at a small fraction of the previous cost and cutting months off of traditional acquisition timelines through utilization of 3D printing. Congress also needs to stop putting its own special interests over the national interests. I am very concerned that the return of earmarks will result in hundreds of millions of defense dollars being siphoned away from urgent needs to instead pay for those politicians' pet projects. That is always bad business. So right now, Congress is preventing DoD from saving $500 million by closing and consolidating unused, unnecessary, and duplicative storage centers. This is a significant amount of money that could be repurposed for immediate defense needs. When I suggested allowing DoD to make these savings by streamlining its operations, the idea was immediately rejected for purely parochial reasons. There is no room for pork in the defense budget. Beyond empowering our unit level operators and our military to identify and remedy mission inefficiencies, Congress must demand accountability across all national security agencies. The $140 million sent to 57 foreign governments by the National Institutes of Health is supposedly a foreign policy tool, but folks, in reality, it's no more than a directionless boondoggle that does not make America safer or more prosperous. The NIH sent over $1.1 million in US taxpayer money to the UK to hook fish on nicotine and ecstasy. Okay, fish on nicotine and ecstasy. Another example, $900,000 to Chile to get mice drunk in the dark. $2.3 million to Canada to force feed mice human feces. $1 million to Nigeria to feed pregnant rats high salt diets. And you tell me, folks, is this a wise use of American tax dollars? But it's not just passing a timely audit that will help stop this frivolous spending. Like every other government agency, the Pentagon has funded its share of questionable projects, such as studying why dogs are so friendly and developing a smartphone app to alert people when to take a coffee break. I don't know that we need that. Last year, through the National Defense Authorization Act, I forced Pentagon grant recipients to include a price tag disclosing the cost to taxpayers for military research. And it seems so simple, but transparency is often the first step to accountability. I also asked the Government Accountability Office to investigate the most expensive cost overruns in weapons systems and force the Pentagon to disclose to Congress their top 10 most expensive weapons to fix and maintain. Under my leadership on the Senate Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee in last year's NDAA, we cut $300 million in research and development programs that were wasteful, duplicative, or simply not a priority. Instead, this funding will be redirected towards urgent research needs, such as getting a deployable vaccine for our troops and for funding traumatic brain injury programs. Finally, I want to touch on a priority of mine in this year's defense bill. It was recently reported that the Department of Defense gave millions of dollars to EcoHealth Alliance. That is the nonprofit that funneled US taxpayer dollars to the Wuhan lab in China to fund coronavirus studies. Along with those millions of dollars, of course, that they received from the NIH, that nonprofit has received over $41 million from the Pentagon since fiscal year 2008. Folks, EcoHealth Alliance, the group that knowingly misled the world about what may have happened in Wuhan, China, should not receive another dime from taxpayers until it fully complies with the law and answers questions about what was really going on at the Wuhan Institute. And I'll be working in this year's NDAA to make that a priority. So once again, a big thank you to the National Taxpayers Union and the R Street Institute for inviting me to be with you today. And with that, Andrew, let's go ahead and take some questions.
Thanks, Senator. And I'm going to turn it to my colleague Jonathan first, but I know your time is short. We'll be respectful of it, but yeah, look forward to it. Thank you for your remarks. And Jonathan, you want to start?
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your leadership on this issue, and I think challenging the dogma maybe that just spending more is always better. I think that's a problematic in a whole host of areas, and the defense budget is one of those. I wanted to take a step back. Obviously, you Andrew mentioned at the outset the letter that you co-wrote to Secretary Austin, urging sort of a timely completion of the next audit. Maybe for our listeners who aren't as familiar with the audit process, if you could, explain why you see it as so important to taxpayers, why you see it as important for service members, and why you are sort of leading this effort.
Right. And of course, I spent time, my first elected office was that of county auditor in the county that I reside in today, Montgomery County, Iowa. And of course, that was years ago. And it is a much smaller scale when we're auditing rural counties than the DOD, but the same concept applies. Just like any state, local agency, a federal agency like the DOD has to be held accountable for how it handles taxpayer money. And of course, results of an audit can help Congress work with our defense comptroller and their team to identify taxpayer savings and ensure that the budget remains very focused on national security mission sets and not the bureaucracy. How does that translate down to the soldiers on the ground, like my truck drivers in Kuwait and Iraq? If we are improving upon the efficiencies in the DoD, if we're identifying how those streams of funding are being handled or mishandled, it ensures that when we do invest those dollars, those resources towards those airmen, Marine soldiers on the ground, that it is being used appropriately. We are providing the resources to the very people that are out there on the ground doing our work. So that is why it's so important that we remain focused on this and make sure that we are getting to, if not a completely clean audit, as close as we possibly can. It's for those men and women.
No, you're right, Senator. It's so important. I actually want to turn to a separate bipartisan effort that you led in last year's defense policy bill, the NDAA, that would have required federal agencies to report on projects that are over budget and behind schedule. This was a really important effort. NTU was proud to support it. Can you talk a little bit about why this is so important for taxpayers?
Right. It is really important to identify these projects that are way over schedule and over budget. And the amendment was very clear. I mean, enough is enough. Let's get a handle on this. Those projects really need to be on time. And certainly if they could be done on time, we're not going to spend as much on them, continuing to pump good money after bad. So just take a look at the JEDI program that the Pentagon just scrapped. More accountability and consultation was needed to keep that procurement free from political interference and on schedule. Now the project is dead. My amendment wasn't about killing programs, but giving Congress the opportunity to provide that civilian oversight on behalf of those taxpayers to make sure that the money is being spent in the wisest possible way. So again, very, very clear amendment. Let's make sure those projects are completed on time and on budget.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. It's amazing how things that may seem small, these can have a really outsized impact. And I think that oftentimes people don't necessarily think about the amendment process to the NDAA and the impact that these amendments can have. So I very much, like Andrew, applaud you for that. Maybe taking it a little broader, you mentioned sort of being elected and to target pork spending and that being something that you're passionate about. that is something that I think is obviously very difficult. A number of us have obviously all been doing work on this issue for a really long time, and so I wonder if you could talk about some of these other efforts that you've been focusing on that you think are particularly could be as impactful as the amendment we already talked about.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was sent to Washington, D.C. by my fellow Iowans to make D.C.'s big spenders squeal. And I love that phrase, and it's really caught on across the board. But every month, I give out a squeal award that shines light on some of those examples of wasteful Washington spending, along with proposals and possible action items to address it. So not only do I want to identify areas of waste, it doesn't do any good to just identify it, but also how do we take action to address it? So for example, when I learned taxpayer dollars from the NIH were being funneled into the Wuhan Institute of Virology in Communist China, I gave NIH a squeal award and then successfully offered an amendment to cut off the funding to that Chinese lab permanently. And again, it was successful. You know, we can't win without some support from the party that is running Congress. And that's why I try to work with as many Democrats as I can to find areas where we agree and save taxpayer dollars. So another example here. I've been working with Senator Hassan of New Hampshire to change the composition of coins. And, everybody's wondering, why are you doing that? Well, ironically, we lose money when we are literally making money. Our bill could save $10 to $17 million a year. And that is just common sense. Because most spending in Washington occurs out of the view of the public, I've also proposed a number of bills that make these decisions more transparent. And of course, when they're more transparent, they're more accountable to all of you, the taxpayers. So I've got a lot of efforts that are ongoing, but again, we're trying to make our big spenders squeal.
Well, no, I appreciate that, Senator, and you hit on a good point that a lot of these efforts are really going to require some bipartisan buy-in to pass in a closely divided Congress. So appreciate your work there. I know I know we only have you for a few more minutes, so I'll ask you one more question if that's all right. To zoom out even further from pork spending, it seems the debt and deficit situation in our nation is getting out of control. What are you and your colleagues working on to get this country back on the right fiscal path?
Thank you for that. And I do a 99 county tour every year. I visit all of Iowa's 99 counties. And here recently, especially as I'm out on the trail in Iowa, I hear from Iowans about this. They're so worried about Washington spending. And so, as I had mentioned before, I am working with not only Republicans, but also Democrats to find ways to reduce wasteful spending and bring more transparency to Washington. After all, no one wants the notoriety that comes with spending taxpayer dollars on crazy ideas like shrimp on a treadmill. So over the last 6 months, Washington has really been splurging like never before without restraint. And it looks like the Democrats are just getting started with their spending spree. I can assure you I'll be on the front lines fighting for taxpayers and making those spenders squeal. Again, it is vitally important that we highlight these areas where not only is just big spending increasing our deficit and our debt, but also finding those ways to make it better. So we'll continue to do that. And I again, thank you so much for your time today and for shining such a great emphasis on these issues.
For sure. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciated your remarks, and I know we're at our time, so certainly let you go. But yeah, thank you again so much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Everybody have a good day.
Well, great. Well, we're going to transition to the second half of our program now with another fantastic guest, Elaine McCusker, who joins us from the American Enterprise Institute, where she is a fellow who focuses on defense strategy, on budget and innovation. And has really just an incredible resume and an incredible amount of expertise on these issues. And I should have said senior fellow. Before joining AEI, Ms. McCusker served as deputy and then acting Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller from August 2017 until June 2020. So you'd be hard pressed to find someone who's perhaps more of an expert on the audit. In total, she served for more than 13 years at DoD, including at U.S. Central Command, the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense, and Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition. And prior to that was a professional staff member on Senate Armed Services Committee for 3 years on Capitol Hill. So really an impeccable resume. So Elaine, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's maybe just start off again talking about the audit, but I'm also just giving your resume, just really interested to hear about your experience at DoD and how it kind of informed how you think about some of these questions of defense strategy, and I guess how you assess the defense budget more broadly. So maybe we can kind of start at a high level before digging in.
Yeah, great. And I kind of have a couple of things I want to maybe open with on that front. I was also interested in Senator Ernst's comments, particularly highlighting some of the highly questionable non-defense spending in the defense budget, which I think is bad and getting worse. But first, I'd like to highlight 3 points specifically related to the DoD audit. And I'll call it the full financial statement audit, since the department is subject to hundreds of audits each year. So I want to make sure we're clear on what we're talking about. And so first, the Department of Defense was not designed or built to be auditable. Its systems were put together over time to be responsive to warfighting needs and to build, explain, and execute budgets. Simply put, defense financial systems were established to track how the department applies funding to defend the country. They were not set up for business efficiency or to produce detailed financial documentation at the enterprise level. Nevertheless, DoD is now standardizing and consolidating the hundreds of systems that it used to buy and maintain what it needs. It's going to take time. Second, the DoD approach to the full financial statement audit is changing its culture and improving performance, responsive, resilience, and agility, all crucial elements to future military competitiveness. And so what do I mean by this? I mean, the department didn't take a box check approach to the audit. It set upon a journey to make real positive changes and then institutionalize those changes. It set out to strengthen financial management practices and harness the power of its data into a single source of truth. You can imagine the power of that. Doing so will help it pass the audit, but passing the audit is really not the big story. As part of the audit effort, the department built an advancing analytics tool they call Advana. This tool gives military and business decision makers, and it will give Congress, I think, support and analytics visualization to help them better do their jobs. And because of this approach, the audit also positioned the department to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and is helping the department change its culture to meet its mission more effectively in real time. Third, there's a lot of damaging myths about DoD accountability and spending. Just a few days ago, during the House Appropriations Committee consideration of the fiscal year 2022 defense spending bill, we heard seasoned members of Congress say they have no idea where DoD spends its money. Now, I realize some of this is political theater and rhetoric, but it is also misleading and irresponsible. DoD provides thousands of reports on its programs and where the money goes. It goes to planes, tanks, vehicles, ships, satellites, people, schools, stores, and digital architecture. People also love the age-old stories of expensive things. I think we heard one just a couple of minutes ago. But a couple of years ago, there was a question about how much the department is spending on crab and lobster. And once you dig into stories like this, as we did with this one, most of the time you find nothing crazy or irresponsible is going on. For example, in this case, if you search the contracting database for these words, it brings up every contract in which they are mentioned. And it gives you the full contract value of the words that are in there, even if they're an ingredient in a salad or something, or if the contract is buying a lot of other stuff. So that's just one example, I think, of how sometimes these stories and these myths get kind of blown out of proportion. And so I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. You asked me a question about overall experience. I don't know if you want me to kind of stomp into that wonderfully broad question, or if you want to steer somewhere else over.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can ask. I'm my interest was mainly in just sort of how your experience has informed the way that you think about these questions of strategy and the budget broadly. I think that obviously Senator Ernst laid out at a high level the reason for the audit, and I just wonder from your perspective, if you, as kind of an insider in a sense, if you agree with the senator's remarks in that regard, or if maybe you have a different sort of rationale as to why you think that an audit is necessary or proper.
I definitely agree with what she said about transparency and accountability. And I think that the department has a lot to gain in how it sees itself through the audit. There's a lot of benefit from program management, decision-making perspective, efficiency that we're seeing in there. I also think there's probably about three things I have shaped my view about strategy and budget. First, the importance of a resource-informed strategy that's actually clear and used. Second is the impact of annual uncertainty and delayed budgets year after year. And third is what is possible and where opportunities for improvement exist. And I'd like to talk about each of those real quick if I could. So first, on strategy and budget. Under the Budget Control Act and the bipartisan budget agreements, I think that time period really showed us the importance of a clear, implementable strategy accompanied by operational orders that were resourced and doable. And it showed us what happens when strategy and budget become disconnected, yet you try to pretend they are not and keep working to make it all fit. It results in this sort of cognitive dissonance as you put together the program and the budget. And as you try to carry out campaign plans at the COCOMs at increasing levels of risk to the plan and the force over time. And I think during that time period, we had a lot of this going on without sort of one clear set of direction to follow. Second, the impact of annual and compounding uncertainty. I know this is a tired subject, but I think people may still not fully realize the impact, immediate and cumulative, of more than a decade of budget unpredictability and continuing resolutions. Some people say, and I hear this all the time, that so long as the annual appropriations are eventually passed, everything's fine. Well, this is not true. We can't buy back time lost during a CR. It costs time and money. We lost 1,268 days in the last 11 years this way. For example, if you're aware of a capability you really need to buy or research, let's say in microelectronics or hypersonics or quantum computing or satellite launches, or even a non-advanced aircraft that is effective and efficient for counterterrorism, but you can't get going with it for the first 6 months of the year because you were under continuing resolution, you can't get that 6 months back when you are finally ready to award the contract. And since you know this is likely to be the case year after year, pretty soon you don't even plan to buy much until late in the year. So you lose that time every year. And so to be blunt, you just cannot be the smartest customer with the best plan and get the most out of your money when you don't get your budget on time. And finally, in my time working with the Navy under the MRAP program, I saw what the department can do with a clear vision, leadership attention, experts in acquisition, program management and financing, and congressional partnership. And then as Comptroller, I saw this a bit again with budgeting to support the National Defense Strategy, a single strategy that was not one of those things that the department just put on the shelf. I mean, this is something we talked about every day. And so I see, opportunities for improvement, shed some of the historical ways of developing and buying things so the department can better compete in time. And I think we saw this clearly with the Artificial Intelligence Commission report, which was actually front and center again. Just earlier this week, there was a day-long Global Emergency Technology Summit. And according to the AI Commission report from earlier this year, the Department of Defense is not set up for success in resourcing AI. The commission says, and I quote, unless the requirements, budgeting, and acquisition processes are aligned to permit faster and more targeted execution, the US will fail to stay ahead of potential adversaries. So I think this blunt conclusion demands attention and emphasizes the urgency of updating the way the department budgets and is funded. So those are just a couple of macro takeaways from my perspective on what I've learned on sort of the budget and strategy dynamic.
That's awesome. It's one of the many reasons we wanted to chat with you today, because you have this deep well of experience. I want to actually drill down into something you said towards the end of that answer, which is talking about opportunities for DoD to improve its budgeting process, or I'm not sure, and you can sort of maybe tease out this difference here, whether these are things that need to be directed and improved by Congress. There's obviously a lot of room for Congress to improve itself as an institution. We talk about the uncertainty caused by continuing resolutions, but as from the perspective of someone who literally managed and helped control this process at DoD for several years, and someone now sort of someone who's outside government and who is nonetheless like an expert on these issues, what are some of sort of the top level ways you would go about changing how DoD manages its budget process?
So I think you're absolutely right that there is a lot that the department needs to do for itself. And, you know, the audit is one of the ways it can help itself see itself so it can make some of those changes and improvements. And then there are some things I think that do require a partnership with Congress. And, you know, I don't want to be in that category where you always say, well, we just need more flexibility and we need Congress to give it to us. I mean, that's part of the answer. And I think when you look at things like, the reprogramming thresholds and, sort of the way that the department struggles to be agile and responsive can be a really interesting puzzle. And I think people may not realize how little money DoD can move during the year without this lengthy approval process. For example, what company would be able to estimate its financial needs to the program element and budget activity level at the scope that DoD does 18 months in advance, with only the ability to move less than 1%, and in some cases, only 1/10,000th of an account within the budget without their board of directors approval? And so I think to help on this front, DoD needs two things: updated reprogramming and transfer thresholds, and real-time visibility for Congress for oversight. So we have to balance those things. I mean, we can't expect that Congress is just going to say, okay, I grant you all these new things, but now I have no way to do my job and my part of the equation, which is to do oversight. So we need both of those to come together. And I think we need to eventually move past kind of the artificial divisions we have in the budget, or what we call colors of money that we have right now. And we're starting to see that a little bit. The department proposed, this digital software pilot program last year and has expanded it this year. And Congress has been supporting that. But of course, Congress is going to want to know, soon, okay, how's that working? How do you know how you're doing, and what can we see as a result? But I think that's really important movement in the right direction. And I think, looking at programming and budgeting, and really the entire planning, programming, budgeting, and execution process. So we've seen a lot of work done over the last decade or so on acquisition, but really we haven't looked at PPBE in a long time. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there to do that. And again, a lot of internal to what DoD does. I mean, does it really still reflect the way we need to develop, test, and field things? Does it support the joint warfight? Does it produce a discussion and set of decisions that help more quickly close the kill chain? So that's another area where I think, we really need to look at, and I, through AAI in partnership with others, have proposed some ideas to do that. And then on this question, the final thing I'll say is looking at the avalanche of justification documents, some in hard copy. I mean, they are still produced and delivered to the Hill. And really looking at, are those narratives being understood and used? Do they meet the intent? I think we see increasing evidence through congressional report language that they don't. And yet the department is producing those specifically for Congress. And if Congress is unhappy with them, it's probably a really good time to have a partnership to take a look. I mean, if both sides are unhappy, some changes need to be made. Over.
I think that's so interesting, and that's so true in my experience. Just as sort of someone who's written about and thought about this from the outside, I wonder how optimistic you are. In a sense, I mean, it's easy. I think we talk about these issues all the time, and I think it's very easy to see the budget just constantly increasing and have the perspective that it's just not actually feasible to make some of the changes that a lot of us are advocating for or would like to see. And so I wonder if you could maybe just talk a little about how optimistic you are. We had one of the guests that we had a few months ago was a former Chief Management Officer Lisa Hirschman, and sort of talking about the way that kind of waste is marbled into the Pentagon budget, and the degree to which how much of that can you remove, or how much do you kind of need to focus on these bigger picture kind of foreign policy, almost strategy type questions. So I guess I'm asking sort of a two-part question. One is just in general, how optimistic are you that you think we can make these kind of changes? And I guess the related question is, where do you see the effort being the most productive? Is it in trying to go and get out some of that fat that's marbled in, so to speak, or do you think that to really see change, you need to kind of think even bigger picture, and in some cases, maybe even rethink the specific missions or the broader goals that the department is being tasked with?
So first off, I think the optimism has not been stomped out of me yet. And so I am still optimistic. And one of the reasons for that is that there are so many incredibly dedicated, expert, creative, adaptable, resilient staff within the department, and OSD and the services and the defense agencies on the joint staff and at the COCOMs, that I think, that combined with I think a real genuine interest on both sides of the aisle on Capitol Hill to do things differently and better and get at creative solutions. And then of course, being on the outside now where you have a little bit more time to think and maybe offer some recommendations, I think there's a lot of opportunity. And I think right now we have an awareness and also a building momentum and understanding of where we might be missing opportunities, which is got an exciting element to it because you can stop missing those opportunities, right? I mean, you can move faster and be better and close the kill chain faster. And so I think so I'm optimistic on that front. I think, when I look at the challenges that the department faces, and you've got the acquisition side, logistics side, the financial management side, one of the things, and I'll keep getting back to the audit, that the audit has done is gone from saying, people used to think, well, that's an FM thing. The financial managers need to fix that junk. This is a whole department thing. And I think people get that now. And as you hear about some of the things that, people can harvest their money, they can get their floor to match their book, and their book to match the floor, so they know what they have and improves their ordering and their supply chain. I think, more and more that happens, there's going to be more improvement. And, one of the things that sort of two things that I sort of always ask myself in attacking problems inside the department and putting puzzles together was, first, is this legal, ethical, and accountable use of taxpayer funds? And so a lot of times people might focus on, is this legal? Well, I can't just, yes, it has to be legal, but it also has to be ethical and accountable. And I think that's important to keep in mind for good stewardship. And the second thing, also a really simple one, is what do I know? Who needs to know it, and have I told them? And communication is so key throughout the department and external to the department, that I always want to keep those things in mind to solve any problem that you have in front of you. And I guess I'll avoid harping on CRRs and government shutdowns and the wastefulness of that again right this second. But I think that there's also a need to focus on the E and PPBE. And that gets to what I mentioned earlier about during the year of execution, can you adapt? Can you, let go of your commitment to a program of record that's not doing well, and move money and scale up on something that has gone through some iterative testing and is doing well? And I think right now our incentive structure may not completely support that. So I'll stop there. And there are a lot we could talk about on that front, but I'll stop there for now.
No, for sure. And you could talk to us for the remainder of our time about the wastefulness of CRs and shutdowns. I think you'd find common thinking with Jonathan and I. But I do want to turn to Congress and talk about something from a legislative perspective. We talked with congressional offices, and you've probably seen, Elaine, like various carrots and sticks being discussed regarding the DoD audit process from a congressional perspective. An example of the former would be the requirement from last year's NDAA that DoD leaders study possible incentives for the achievement of an unqualified opinion, and that passed in last year's NDAA. An example of the latter, the sticks, would be new legislation that, full disclosure, NTU supports, but we don't shy away from disagreement on the webinar. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Legislation from Senators Bernie Sanders and Chuck Grassley that would result in 1% budget cuts for DoD components that fail to achieve a clean audit. Do you have thoughts on these competing approaches, and especially from sort of having been on the operational side, how either the carrot or the stick approach would impact your day-to-day former role at DoD?
Yeah, so I think we are, I don't think we're at the penalty stage. And I think it would actually be a counterproductive incentive. So 1% penalty, what does that incentivize? Should you drop everything and pursue temporary fixes to your problems, even if you push your problems onto other people so you can get over the bar and avoid losing your 1%? Or is it better if you continue to make long-lasting positive change that is institutionalized and accumulates benefits way beyond a clean audit? And this gets back to the approach I mentioned before. Do we want DoD to just find a way to check the box on the audit, which some argue is not really that valuable? Or do we want them to make cultural and institutional changes that benefit performance and program management, transparency for oversight, and harness the power of data and money? Obviously, from the way I ask those questions, you can see how I would answer. I think DoD is on track. I think the best incentive right now is to support what they're doing, hold them accountable for it. If they miss a target or goal, why did they miss it? Help them solve the problem rather than penalize the effort. And I think maybe get people focused on the wrong things.
I think that's a very interesting point, and not actually something that I hadn't quite thought of in exactly that way before. So I think it's a very interesting argument. I think the challenge is always how do you ensure that those steps are being taken, and at what point do you kind of decide that, okay, there's been enough time to take those steps, and that's often I think a tough thing to figure out. I guess to ask a follow-up question to that. So just thinking about timeline then. So we know the department is not planning on, or at least doesn't expect to have a clean audit until I think 2028. So does that timeline strike you as right? Or do you think that, I guess that this is another optimistic, pessimistic kind of question, how optimistic should we be on that front? What are your thoughts on what the timeline is likely to look like over the next, say 5 to 10 years?
So I think timelines are a bit dangerous. I mean, we avoided that in the first couple of years because we didn't know how many unknowns we had. And as audits get deeper, you learn more and more. Now, I think there are some clear paths. Each organization knocks down its fundamental problems, and as the joint problems get brought out and addressed. So I think the timeline is possible, but I also think the benefits achieved along the way are kind of the real story. And I think there's also another element of this that is, maybe a little bit different than the past that the department has done to really help itself on the audit front. So, it put together these tools that you enter in all the audit notice of finding and recommendation, so everything that's wrong with you, you enter into this common database. And then you put all the corrective action plans. And I mean corrective action plans that have specific time horizons to fix things. And at the action officer level in this tool, who's responsible for what and when. And so, I mean, it's, I think, relatively easy for the department to hold itself accountable. I mean, it has your name and phone number in this tool of what you're supposed to be doing and when. And it is in your best interest, if you think you're going to miss a target, to raise your hand and say so early rather than to hide it. I mean, one of the things that this tool does for the department that, reflects lessons learned from the past is, don't hide bad news. I mean, if you're in a situation where you're on the hook to make these changes and you can't do it by yourself, or you need someone else to help you, or someone's not paying attention to you, or whatever. I mean, it really kind of forces you to expose those early. Now, this is all happening internal to the department, and gives the managers a chance to kind of see, am I on track? Am I off track? Why am I off track? But it's also something that the department, I believe, is still. I mean, I've only been gone for about a year, but twice a year briefing Congress, kind of to this level of detail of, so where am I, and what is my my tool showing me about, am I on or off track? And so I think there's tools in place now to really manage this at both the macro and micro level that will help the department stay on track, and will also help anyone who wants to keep holding them accountable for it. And again, I think that's why, you know, we kind of don't want to go into the penalty phase, because we want people to expose what their problems are, and not, you know, try to hide them and pretend everything's okay and nothing to see here. And, you know, I fixed my stuff, but by the way, I just caused a huge problem for someone else, you know, by fixing it. I mean, I want real fixes. And I think that's the approach the department's taking.
No, it's a really thoughtful take. And actually, I want to turn to a question we got from an audience member, and apologies to this audience member because they asked it when we were on with Senator Ernst. Given our limited time with Senator Ernst, I figured, Elaine, it might be a better question for you, especially given your experience. You've touched on a couple times in this discussion the need for more transparency in the defense budget, and quite frankly in federal budgeting and federal spending broadly. We shouldn't just, you know, Jonathan and I are not trying to pick on just the defense budget here. I think we'd like to see transparency improve broadly across all federal agencies. Given your experience and your expertise, how would you go about encouraging more transparency in the defense budget? Do you have some top level ideas in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, there's actually probably a lot of transparency in federal budgeting if you know what to look for and how to look for it. You know, the information is really out there, but it's not necessarily user friendly. And I think particularly, you know, if you don't know an agency's budget that well, and, you know, you kind of can't read between the lines, you're not really sure what you're looking for, that can demonstrate as lack of transparency, because it ends up that's what it is. If you can't read it or understand it, it's not transparent. And so I think it gets back to maybe 2 points. One, just like the way we are doing budget justification documentation and the way we sort of put stuff out there, maybe not the most useful. And one example of this is, you know, when you look at the J books, as we call them, you know, that have all the narrative for every DoD program, and you read this narrative and you go, okay. And what I used to do is sometimes get the subject matter expert and ask them, tell me what you do, what your program does. And they explain it to you, and you're like, okay, I get that. Why didn't you write that down? And so I think, you know, there just is kind of an element of like, there's so much that needs to be put down that, you know, if we can stream that a little bit and get to the root of things and just do it a little bit differently, we'll get better explanations. And I think the other thing is, you know, just more automation, and, you know, the department kind of coming into the modern world on, you know, using bots for repetitive tasks, and, you know, freeing itself from some of the manual type data calls that it does that, you know, reduce the time for analysis and reduce the time that I think would be useful in really providing the kind of transparency you're talking about.
And I guess let me ask you a follow-up question to that, which is, you know, those are these sort of internal things. I wonder if there are process changes external to, you know, the department that you think would be particularly useful. I mean, obviously minimizing, you know, CRs and sort of and government shutdowns are all relevant, but you know, I wonder what your thoughts are. It could be related to those topics specifically, but generally, you know, what are the things external that you would like to see that you think would either help the department, you know, do a better job, or would just sort of, you know, make the entire process of defense budgeting in general operate more smoothly?
So I think, you know, some of the stuff I just discussed, you know, the way the department does its justification is essentially to meet the needs of its customer who has to read all this justification. And like I said earlier, you know, it seems like it's not really meeting the customer's needs. And so we need to kind of get that conversation going to change, you know, sort of that dynamic. And so the department spends its time doing something that is actually going to meet the customer's needs. I think on the other side, you know, it's kind of like, what do you really want to know? What questions do you want to answer? And lack of transparency kind of comes, I think, in 2 forms. One, I don't have the answer to that. And you may not, you know, because my systems are not connected fully yet. And so there are some things that take me a long time to answer because that's just not the way the budget's built. It's not the way I track things. It's an example, you know, back ages ago when I worked in Comptroller the first time, people would say, how much are we spending in Afghanistan? Well, I can tell you how much we're spending on Operation Enduring Freedom. But, you know, like that question, I mean, we weren't designed to answer those questions. Or, you know, a lot of questions you used to get is, you know, how much burden sharing are we getting from partners? Well, we kind of weren't really set up to answer those questions. And so it would be a data call and, it would take forever and people are like, why can't you answer this simple question? Well, it's because, it's not because I don't want to, it's just because it takes me a long time to get the right data and make sure it's correct. And so I think, there are elements of just like, as we go through the audit and get our systems together, you will be able to answer those questions easier and provide more transparency. The other way you don't provide transparency is, you don't really just have that insight for yourself, and so you can't provide it to anyone else. And so I think these things are connected, and as the department gets better at having its systems work for it, it will inevitably provide better transparency on the budget and everything else to its oversight committees and to the public in general, as they desire to see what they want to see.
And there are certainly groups like NTU and R Street that I know want to see more. Again, from every aspect of the federal budget, it's not just defense. So you've given me some reason for optimism on the defense side of things. We're running short on time in the hour, so I kind of wanted to zoom out, Elaine, and ask you a 10,000-foot question. While we've no doubt touched on some of the challenges for your successor in the comptroller position, in the months and years ahead, I was wondering if you could give our listeners a sense of the top couple of challenges that you think your successor is going to be tasked with for fiscal year 2022, for the coming years at DoD, perhaps under the Biden administration specifically. However you want to take that question, I think it would be good to sort of zoom out and get a 10,000-foot perspective.
So I think, I'll look at it just from three different perspectives. First, on the budget and execution. I think that in the near term, Mr. McCord and Kathy Miller, when she gets confirmed, will be kind of faced with a similar situation that we had, where you're kind of in that hopefully transition period where you still got the reprogramming requirements, you have everything kind of, the most part, still structured the way it is, and so you have that adventure that is executing a $700 billion budget each year. And so you just kind of got that mechanics of the business of doing the business that is part of it. Fortunately, the department has people who are incredibly good at this and understand the budget, understand how to come up with creative solutions and work that. I think you also have a focus on the workforce and on the skills and capabilities that you want your workforce to have when you are putting together this single source of truth that I'm talking about. I mean, you need data scientists, you need people who are real, sort of studs at that kind of engineering and sort of doing data translation and data standards and data dictionaries and all those kinds of things, and putting that together and working that advanced analytics tool that I mentioned. And so I think you want people who can do those kinds of things. And then I think you have to continue to focus on the audit. I mean, the audit is, like I said, I don't think that people are going to get too excited about department's actual full financial statement audit, but the improvements that take place in the way that the department was approaching getting a clean audit opinion are game changing from my perspective, and will help with management and decision making and transparency and accountability and answering those golden questions that you want to have answered. And so I think those are the kinds of things that I would remain focused on going forward, and I think are going to be something that is good for the taxpayer. I mean, you want to be able to see that your money is working for you the way you want it to work for you. The other thing I'd like to see, and I'm very concerned about, is non-defense spending in the defense budget, and how misleading that is to the public on how much they're spending for their national security. And posted a blog just yesterday about the House Appropriations Committee mark and kind of emphasizing this for people. I think we need to expose that, so that if you want DoD to continue to have this mission creep and to do these things, people need to at least be aware that that's taking place. Over.
Absolutely. It's probably a good place to end it. And I think Andrew and I would agree on that point for sure. Well, I guess we're toward the end, so we'll wrap up there. But Elaine, thank you so much. I think this was a very, very interesting conversation, and hopefully Ms. Miller is watching and we'll take those recommendations to heart. But it gave us a lot to think about, I think, and was a really interesting conversation, and really, really appreciate your time.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for everything you guys do, and for holding this session.
Awesome. All right. Well, we will obviously let everyone know who's listening. Our next episode, episode 8, will be upcoming. But thank you all for tuning in today. Thank you again, Elaine, and top of the hour. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.